some people just can't get used to that, right? And so it takes a lot mentally to get to the next level in the sport and to get comfortable. And it's more mental than physical in many ways.
And kind of to your point, it does seem like the gender gap in MMA is closing a lot faster than in other sports, right? In terms of popularity, like Ronda Rousey, I mean, it's people becoming household names that, in other sports, we haven't kind of bridged that gap yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about that, right? You don't have, outside of soccer and maybe even basketball, there's no women's football league. And even in boxing, like the women's boxing doesn't get anywhere near the visibility that men's boxing gets. So MMA, so that's something I haven't thought about a lot, but you do see that very often, that you're going to see more and more women fighters coming up to the ranks. Like women's MMA is still in its infancy, right? The whole Ronda Rousey phenomenon is, less than 4 or 5 years old. 10 years ago, there were no women in the UFC. And actually the owner of the UFC, one of the owners, his name was Dana White, he was the CEO as well. He just said, I'm not going to have any women in the UFC, and that's the stance. And, people just didn't raise an eyebrow when he said that. And then you fast forward, 5 or 6 years, some of the women are leading, the main events of these cards and are doing, in terms of business, the pay-per-views are, nearly as big as the men's fights.
So it's, kind of belies like a cultural shift, right? Rather than an accessibility shift.
Oh,
it's just the culture just kind of turned,
And they're selling a story. Like it doesn't matter if it's a man or woman or whatever. It's a story behind the fight, and people want to see good storylines.
Right. And very strong people compete. Yeah.
You have to be the minimum bar is you need good fighters, right? Mm-hmm. And a good fighters is not enough to make a good fight that people want to see. Mm-hmm. Right? You need the villain, and like Conor McGregor's been the villain for the UFC for the last couple of years, and now I don't know, that last fight he made what, 50, 60, 70 million dollars against Mayweather to do a boxing match. Like that kind of money was unheard of 10 years ago. People are still fighting for $20,000. After your manager takes a cut, after your coaching staff takes a cut, like you're left with nothing. And if you're injured, I mean, it's a tough life.
Right. It's one of those sports, if you don't make it to the highest level in other sports, you're kind of left physically intact, right? Whereas I imagine a lot of people that, want to make it on a UFC card, they dedicate their whole lives to this, and then, there's a lot of physical repercussions and consequences for sparring and training every day for the past, 10 years. What's the conversation inside the sport with regards to CTE and kind of the increasing evidence we have about, the dangers of shots to the head? Or
so you've seen the bigger camps in the country take it seriously, right? Because you hear the conversation mostly about football. Mm-hmm. You're starting to hear it about soccer.
You're just like, it's not worth it.
I have kids, and I wouldn't let them play football, right? Because
right.
of CTE. And you see that, a decade ago when people were training, they were training 100%. Even in practice, they were going all out and sparring. And I also remember when I used to spar a lot is after a sparring practice, the rest of the day was gone. Like I knew I was going to have a headache, and I was going to go home and just sleep it off. But you didn't know better. You didn't worry about CTE. You're just like, you had a headache from boxing.
Right. You brush it off.
You just brush it off. Mm-hmm. And so, that happened after, a few years of that. You're like, man, that just can't be right. There's got to be something. Even before people were talking about CTE, like, I should be a little bit more careful because something isn't quite right. I knew it wasn't right, but you couldn't you didn't identify what caused that. Mm-hmm. And now you see people are much safer in the way they spar. They don't go as hard. They limit the number of active sparring sessions and rounds they do. They're much more strategic about that, saving some of the harder rounds just before a fight, because you have to spar in order, the only way to get good at fighting is to fight. And going, 50% isn't going to get you ready for a fight. But limiting, you also don't need 100 rounds of hard sparring against guys that are 30 pounds bigger than you. Gary Goodrich was a very popular fighter 10 or 15 years ago. He fought in a show called Pride in Japan. And Pride was like part UFC, part WWE. And, they had one event around New Year's of 2001, where they drew a stadium that had over 100, 150,000 people watching a fight. They would have a giant 400-pound guy, 7'4", fighting a 140-pound Japanese guy. Like it was more theatrics, but it was a real fight. And everybody watched it. And you could only Here in the U.S., you only got it if you stayed up like really late because it was coming out of Japan. And so there's a fighter, Gary Goodridge, who's from Canada, and he fought in a couple of UFCs. He's a super tough guy, former arm wrestler, 260 pounds, just built like a tank. And he would fight anyone, anywhere, and mostly a striker. But he was getting knocked out, 3 or 4 times a month at some point because they put him against the highest level guy. The Japanese loved him because he lived by the sword, he died by the sword. And, he's either going to knock someone out or he's going to get knocked out, but he always put up a good fight. They loved him. And so he was just, at one point in his career, he's getting knocked out so many times. And then now if you see him, it's tragic, right? Like he has a severe, well, you can't diagnose CT, but severe brain damage. Like when he talks, there's an impediment. You can't understand when he's saying a lot of words. And hopefully he, I don't know how much better he can get, and I haven't seen him in a couple of years, and I've met other fighters through the years. I've had an opportunity to be in somebody's corner in the UFC a few times. And through that, I've met a bunch of fighters. And, some of them they've stopped fighting because some of the brain exams come back and they're noticing patterns that shouldn't be there. They haven't been diagnosed with anything yet, but it's concerning enough where they stopped.
Right. And I mean, I guess it's just, different calculus for each individual. You have some people, to counter that, you have high-profile players that have come out and said, they don't really care. Like, this is what they want to do. They want to play football, and they'll die doing it. And I feel like that it's almost inherent in MMA if you want to make it to a certain level. Is that something you kind of like watch out for, or how does kind of like the MMA circuit deal with? Yeah,
it's calculus. You look at what's the probability of you making millions of dollars, and what's the risk associated with that? Some people are comfortable with that risk, and some people aren't.
Right.
Do you have other options in life to do other things that you might love, right? I have 2 daughters, but if I had a son, would I want him to go into mixed martial arts? Absolutely not. Right? Do I want him to train martial arts? For sure.
Right.
Do I want him to fight? No. The more you train, the more you realize that you probably don't want to fight because of the inherent dangers of it. Just training gives you a taste. And training martial arts is different than the sport of mixed martial arts, right? Training martial arts can be done safely, and it can be done where you learn at that very highest level and you learn fighting like everybody else. Stepping into a ring and actually competing it's a different thing. It's a different beast. And it's a lot more dangerous. And I don't know if the rewards aren't there yet for most of the people. Like, there's probably fewer than 10 guys that make millions fighting, right? Right. The most, if you're an undercard guy, even at the UFC, which is the NFL of fighting, you're making $2,000 to fight and $2,000 to win. Maybe now it's like $4,000 to show and $4,000 to win for $8,000 after taxes and paying everyone. You fall for $1,000. You got to be kind of crazy to, it's not about the money for a lot of these guys. Right. And it's about, you have to respect someone who's willing to sacrifice a lot to achieve what they really want. And they're sacrificing a lot, right? They could be doing other things. They could be making money, having families, going out there. They've given up a lot to be in the ring in terms of training and, physically, their health. Everything's at risk there. And, it's that whole samurai spirit that some people have that, they want to be champion. And it's not about the $2,000 or the $1 million. They want to be the number one fighter in the world. Yeah. Right.
Chicago, the Windy City, the city of broad shoulders, the second city, is complicated.
Known for its legacies of segregation and political corruption, Chicago has a lot to grapple with.
On Chicagoland, we bring you conversations with activists, journalists, politicians, and others who are working to address these issues.
You can find Chicagoland wherever you listen to podcasts.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts,
this is Chicagoland.
Do you foresee any, in the future, as, more scientific research comes out and stuff, with the government stepping in and maybe enforcing some certain rules on UFC or just?
I think it was a decade ago where John McCain stepped in. They tried to ban the UFC. Like, UFC was on its last legs in the late 90s, early 2000s, right? There's pay-per-views were dismal. I think 40 or 50,000 people were buying it. Not enough to make it interesting. They were losing money at every show. John McCain took an interest, said this is human cockfighting. This can't be legal. A lot of the fights went underground at that point. It was essentially dead in the water. And, Dana White was the guy who said, there's something here. We just need to create some rules around the sport. We need some more regulations. We need to professionalize it. He talked to a couple of his friends who happened to be very wealthy, the Fertitta brothers, and they bought the UFC. And I think they paid, it was like $2 or $3 million, something just like absolutely nothing. And, it took them a few years to turn it around. And I think ultimately they had to invest 20 or 30 million bucks. Mm-hmm. But they just sold it. Was it last year or 2 years ago for 4.2 billion? Like that's a pretty good return on investment for $2 million. But they implemented certain standards that professionalize the sport, right? Mm-hmm. And it's still a brand new sport. Like, where was football or baseball after 25 years?
Right.
And then new rules will come, and the government will probably intervene at some point. All it takes is one death in the ring or in the cage.
Right.
And it's happened. Right? People have died in the cage, and they've had, they probably had
just
10
not
people.
Here
just not in the UFC.
On pay-per-view, right.
In amateur levels, people die.
Yeah.
You don't hear about boxing, but boxing every year suffers 5 to 10 deaths internationally. UFC probably has 1 to 2, just because there aren't as many fights. There's been 10 or 15 deaths, but none on pay-per-view. And as soon as that happens, there's going to be an uproar and someone's going to step in.
Right.
It's inevitable.
It doesn't have to be a death, right? Just I feel like anything on pay-per-view. Same thing with football, right? One hit that, God forbid, but leaves somebody paralyzed or something, right? That's on Monday Night Football on live TV, right?
Yeah. I trained. We don't have any. We had a couple professionals. So we had 2 guys that fought in the UFC at the gym. And now they're trainers, a little bit older. But we have a bunch of amateurs. And so there's probably, there's 10 or 15 people that train to fight, and they want to be professional at some point. And so we go to cards all over the Midwest to compete. In 2013-14, I went to a show out in Peoria. And so one of my friends was on the car, and I was like, it's a Saturday night. You have a couple of beers, and you want some fights. And so we're literally cage side, and we're watching this fight, and they needed more coaching before they got into the ring. And one guy jumped on the other guy's back, so that's a normal position in the fight. The guy stood up, and the guy's hanging on his back trying to choke him. The guy who was standing, he tried to roll out of to escape. So basically, he wanted to flip, and he wanted to not land on his head, but land on his opponent's head to get him off. Fortunately, it didn't happen like that. He spiked himself on the head, and his body went limp instantly. I almost lost. Like, it was just sickening to hear the sound because you knew it was over. You knew he was his opponent knew something happened because he was just laying limp on the mat. I couldn't watch anymore, so I had to leave. And then a week later, I was just like, I didn't stop thinking about it. I was like, I had to find out what happens to this kid. And so I called a reporter in the Tribune. I said, this is what happened at an event. Can you investigate? And the guy's like, yeah. So he looks into it and he writes a story about it. The kid he's a super nice kid. He was a breadwinner in his family. He had like 4 or 5 brothers and sisters, and it was just him and his mom. And he never walked again. And this is, I found him online, and I reached out to him a couple years later, and I bring him to the gym occasionally, but he's in a wheelchair, and he's probably going to be in a wheelchair the rest of his life. Last year, maybe even 2 years back, one of my friends works for the UFC, and I said, hey, can we bring this guy to the fights? So he called Dana White up, and then Dana White, gave him backstage passes, took him, they brought him right in, they gave him the VIP treatment. And, you asked him, like, do you regret doing this? He still says no. I
feel like that's kind of the attitude you have to have, right? To do a lot of sports and a lot of, not even sports, any endeavor that you want to be really good at, right? But not all of them have the consequences that.
And that's the worst.
Young guy suffered.
The only thing worse is death at that point, right?
Right.
Imagine, one day you could walk, the next day you're
right.
Paralyzed.
It's completely life changing.
But the crazy thing is, he hasn't given up. Like, he's hungry. He has ideas for business ventures. He's constantly working. He's hustling to make it. He's like, this stuff happens, and he's accepted it, but he hasn't given up. That spirit is what would have made him a great fighter if he had just kind of a little more training, he had a little better coaching at that point. This should never have happened. Like, he probably shouldn't have been in a ring at that point. He needed a little more. But something like that happens on a pay-per-view.
Right.
Someone's going to get involved.
So has the legislative hassle kind of stopped as the UFC and other leagues have tightened up their regulations and passed by scientific research on, the certain regulations that they have and stuff like that? So is that the formalization of the sport, has that helped to kind of ease the pressure from politicians? And
you don't hear people talking about it anymore in the way they did a decade ago.
Right. That's what's interesting, right? Like, you would think following its rise in popularity would be a rise in antagonism, but
yeah, it hasn't.
It's kind of
right. And I think they've brought in more fans. You have people that aren't in martial arts or aren't fighters that are kind of running these organizations now with WME. And I think they bring a different level of sophistication to the sport. Dana White and his team